The opening scene of Our Final Girlie unfolds like a ghost story about girlhood, fear, and forbidden connection, where every laugh and shiver carries the charge of something deeply human and deeply queer. Kira and Lizzie's entry into the abandoned house isn't just a setup for horror, it's a quiet metaphor for transgression, curiosity, and the emotional daring it takes to explore spaces you've been told not to enter, especially as a young woman, and even more so as a queer one. The moment they step into the darkness, joking about trespassing, death, and ghosts, they are already testing boundaries between the living and the dead, between safety and danger, between platonic and romantic closeness. There's an intimacy in the way they talk, an unspoken comfort that hides inside the teasing. Kira's nervousness reads not just as fear of the haunted house, but of something harder to name. Maybe the fear of her own feelings, or the awareness that she's with someone who makes her heart race for reasons that have nothing to do with ghosts. Lizzie, on the other hand, masks her own vulnerability with humor and bravado, using playfulness as a shield. Her jokes about corpses and eyeballs eaten by cats are not just campy horror banter, they're a way to lighten the atmosphere, to keep things within the realm of pretend, to make sure their closeness doesn't reveal too much. In that sense, this haunted house becomes a mirror of what queer women have often had to do: find privacy in hidden spaces, disguise sincerity behind jokes, and build connection in places where it's not supposed to exist. When Lizzie coaxes Kira to dance with me, it's an invitation that's both sweet and defiant. It's the kind of moment that lesbian and queer audiences recognize instantly, when something innocent becomes electric not because of what's said, but because of what's not said. The dance isn't about seduction, it's about safety, about seeing each other in a world that often refuses to see you. It's about turning a site of fear, the haunted, the forbidden, the abandoned, into a place where love and joy can briefly live. The humor, the repeated "I'm sorry," the awkward apologies, all make this scene feel honest and emotionally raw. Women, and especially queer women, know what it's like to apologize for existing in spaces that don't welcome them, to backtrack out of fear of being too much, to giggle through discomfort because seriousness might expose too much truth. That repeated apology becomes almost a ritual, an acknowledgement of guilt for crossing lines, for being present, for wanting something. It's deeply telling that this apology is followed by laughter and dance, the girls rewriting the emotional script they've inherited. Instead of shame, they choose play. Instead of repression, they choose presence. This is the emotional heart of the scene, a queer assertion of existence within fear, a reclamation of joy within constraint. When the radio interrupts with the news of an escaped killer, the shift feels jarring but also symbolic, as if the outside world, with its violence and judgment, is intruding on their private world. For queer women, this intrusion feels familiar. The world has often acted like the escaped killer in their stories, ready to punish joy, ready to reclaim control when women step outside prescribed boundaries. The horror isn't just supernatural, it's social. It's the fear of being seen, found out, or punished for something as simple as connection. And yet, the film doesn't let that fear win. Even as tension builds, even as we sense that danger lurks, the focus remains on the two women and their emotional exchange. The camera lingers on small gestures, hesitation, laughter, shared glances, and in doing so, honors the authenticity of queer intimacy without turning it into spectacle. This is what makes the scene feel so resonant for LGBTQ+ audiences. It doesn't need to shout its queerness to feel queer. It's simply Ayesa, in the way these women exist with each other. Brave, nervous, playful, alive. The haunted house thus becomes a living metaphor for queer love itself. Misunderstood, labeled dangerous, but filled with stories that ache to be heard. And when Lizzie mocks the danger, saying this place isn't that scary, it's as if she's speaking to every queer person who's learned to laugh in the face of the world's fear. Her courage, even when it's part performance, reflects the resilience queer women cultivate daily, turning haunted spaces into homes, turning fear into belonging. The horror genre has historically punished women for their desire, but O Final Girlie flips that trope by letting the women own the frame, by grounding its fear not in their love, but in the violence that threatens it. That's a crucial shift. The scene doesn't say, be afraid of what these women feel. It says, be afraid of what the world does to them. For women watching, especially queer women, this matters deeply. Because so many have lived haunted by memories of what they couldn't say, or who they couldn't love, or where they couldn't safely exist. The way Kira's caution and Lizzie's defiance play off each other reflects a universal tension in queer identity, the pull between hiding and living openly, between fear and freedom. Their conversation about death and ghosts takes on double meaning. They're not just talking about the dead who once lived in that house, but about all the invisible presences that shape them: societal expectations, family silence, internalized fear. When Lizzie tells her to dance, she's offering rebellion disguised as innocence, saying, "For a moment, let's not be afraid of who we are." It's both deeply romantic and deeply political in its quiet way. By the time the scene fades, the question isn't whether something supernatural is lurking. It's whether the girls will allow themselves to feel what's real between them before the world closes in. For women viewers, this scene resonates because it captures a truth that transcends the horror genre, that sometimes the scariest thing isn't the ghost in the room, but the courage it takes to be seen. A Final Girl begins not as a story of survival against a killer, but as a story of emotional survival, of two girls carving out a brief, trembling space for honesty in a world built on fear. And for queer women watching, that's more than horror. That's recognition. That's home. This scene between Anna and Maya in I Final Girla unfolds as a strange, layered haunting, one that is less about ghosts and more about what it means to live with the echoes of queer women's erased stories. At first, the two women's nervous laughter about thumps in the dark plays like a traditional horror setup, but beneath the surface, there's something tenderly human about the way they react to fear together. Their closeness, their shared sense of unease, their playful teasing. It all feels familiar to queer viewers who recognize the fragile safety of being with someone who understands you in a world that too often doesn't. When Anna jokes that the sound might be the ghost of the old lady mad about what we just did in her bed, it's an ironic moment of levity that also speaks volumes. Queer love, especially between women, has historically been treated like something to hide, something shameful, something that might disturb the dead or offend the walls. Yet here, Anna's humor turns that guilt inside out. She owns it, laughs at it, refuses to let fear define her. The tone shifts sharply when the women realize they are somehow witnessing their own deaths, a surreal discovery that collapses the boundary between the living and the dead, the real and the filmed. Their horror at seeing their bodies is visceral, but for queer women, it also hits a symbolic nerve. How many stories of women who loved women have ended this way, buried or rewritten, erased from the record, left as rumors and cautionary tales? Their confusion, "Are we dead? Are we ghosts?" feels like a conversation queer women have had for generations. Are we allowed to exist in full, or are we fated to haunt the spaces that never made room for us? The supernatural logic of this film becomes a poetic metaphor for what it feels like to love openly when society treats that love as something otherworldly, even unnatural. Anna and Maya's realization that they can only cross to the other side in the clothes they died in is a haunting commentary on how women, especially queer women, are often frozen in the images others create of them. Their identities reduced to how they were last seen, how they were last defined, how the world chose to remember them. Maya's frustration at being stuck in my underwear forever captures a deeper truth about how women's bodies are too often made into symbols, how they lose control of their narratives, even after death. Yet in that same breath, she refuses to surrender her humor or humanity. The scene then spirals outward, layering more metatext, influencers, filmmakers, and actors replaying the trauma of these women as entertainment. Addison and Scarlett, the bubbly content creators, stand where the deaths occurred and turn it into content for views, a biting critique of how women's suffering, particularly queer women's, becomes spectacle. The hashtags, #SpookyBabe, #BooMurder, are absurd, but intentionally so, mirroring the real-world ways queer representation is often flattened into aesthetic. What's most striking is how Anna and Maya's quiet, emotional reality contrasts with the exaggerated world around them. Their confusion and vulnerability feel painfully authentic next to the artificial performances of others who treat their love and death as fiction. For queer women watching, this contrast stings. It's the difference between being seen and being consumed. The film seems to ask, what happens when women's real emotions, fear, love, tenderness, are turned into props by an industry that doesn't always understand them? When the director instructs the actresses to recreate the earlier deaths of Tiffany and Stephanie, telling them to just sit here next to me on the couch and to protect one another, the ghostly echo between past and present becomes almost unbearable. The line "you always make me feel safe" takes on tragic resonance. Safety is exactly what queer women are so often denied, whether in fiction or in life. But in that moment, it also becomes a small act of rebellion. To find safety in another woman, even in the midst of violence and confusion, is to reject a world that insists such love is dangerous. When Anna and Maya exchange those final words, "You're so beautiful, you're so totally beautiful," it's not about physical attraction but recognition. They are seeing each other fully, across layers of performance, across death itself. The haunting isn't only supernatural, it's emotional. They're haunted by versions of themselves, by societal scripts that tell them how to act, how to love, how to die, and yet they still find truth in one another. That's what makes this scene so emotionally potent for LGBTQ+ audiences, even in the middle of a horror story. Even surrounded by distortion and exploitation, their connection feels real. They find something pure in a place built on artifice. In a sense, A Final Girlie uses its horror framework to reveal a deeper cultural horror, the casualness with which queer women's stories are reperformed and re-erased, their identities turned into myth or marketing. But by giving Anna and Maya the space to feel confusion, frustration, and affection, to exist as complex women rather than just victims, the film refuses to let them fade into tropes. It gives them interiority, it gives them dignity. For queer women watching, this matters profoundly. It says, you are not a ghost. Your story is not something to be retold by others for shock value. Your love is not a haunting. It's human. The social commentary running through the scene is sharp but heartfelt. Women's voices are too often drowned out by those who speak for them, their experiences commodified or trivialized. Yet within that, there's still joy, humor, and love. Maya's sarcasm, Anna's quiet panic, their shared glances. These details remind viewers that queer intimacy can exist even amid chaos. The film refuses to define their love through tragedy alone. It's about persistence, about the stubbornness of feeling. As the scene closes and the world continues to replay their story without understanding it, the women's presence lingers like an act of resistance. They refuse to be just another ghost story. For the audience, especially women and queer viewers, this moment lands like a quiet promise. Even in a world that tries to make us spectral, we remain real. Their final words, "You're so beautiful," echo like an invocation of truth. It's what every woman, every queer person longs to hear, stripped of judgment, stripped of fear. In the end, Anna and Maya's haunting isn't about death at all. It's about what survives. Love, recognition, and the courage to keep existing, even when the world keeps trying to turn you into a story someone else can sell. This scene from A Final Girl, featuring Pristine and Victoria, unfolds with an eerie wit that disguises something deeper, a commentary on how women's voices, desires, and identities are misinterpreted, rewritten, and yet persistently returned to reclaim themselves. On the surface, it's a humorous haunting. Two ghosts, Tiffany and Stephanie, confront a film crew for getting their story wrong. But within the laughter and absurdity is a profound metaphor about representation, autonomy, and queer recognition. The ghosts' frustration with how they're portrayed, "Your dialogue is terrible, we never said like any of that," echoes the real-world exasperation queer women feel when their stories are filtered through others' perspectives. They become symbols rather than people, caricatures instead of characters. Their insistence on being seen and heard accurately becomes a quiet rebellion against erasure. In queer storytelling, this resonates powerfully. So many women have lived lives rewritten by others, their truths distorted for comfort or consumption. Here, even in death, Tiffany and Stephanie refuse to let their story be told without them. When the living director dismisses them, assuming they're just actresses, it mirrors how women's real emotions and experiences are often mistaken for performance, particularly queer emotion, which society has historically treated as spectacle. But what begins as comedy shifts into something strangely intimate when the ghosts meet Mary, an older spirit who has lived and loved far longer. Mary's introduction adds texture and history to the scene. She represents the lineage of women whose desires were coded, concealed, or condemned, calling herself a courtesan, the language of an era when women's autonomy was often traded for survival. Her interaction with the living woman, the surprise of touch, the recognition that something real can pass between the living and the dead, feels less like a ghost story and more like a parable about intergenerational queer recognition. When she says, "Some of us can manipulate objects or move energy, and some of us, we can touch the light," the line transcends the supernatural. To queer and female audiences, it reads as metaphor. Some women move through the world unseen but still shape it. Some reach toward light, connection, and truth despite everything that tells them they shouldn't. It's a reminder that queer resilience is a kind of energy, invisible, unacknowledged, but undeniable. The tension rises as Mary's flirtation is interrupted by Tiffany and Stephanie, who teasingly warn that Mary is only trying to get into you. The moment walks a fine line between humor and vulnerability. The ghost's commentary is both comedic and protective. Beneath the playful banter, there's an undercurrent of how women often police or protect one another's boundaries in spaces that are both intimate and unsafe. Mary, confident and unashamed, embodies a kind of unapologetic queerness that many women spend their lives trying to find. Her boldness contrasts with the living woman's discomfort, creating a conversation between generations about permission. Permission to feel, to want, to exist without apology. The living woman's panic, her need to flee from what she doesn't fully understand, mirrors society's persistent unease with female intimacy that falls outside the heteronormative frame. Even in a setting where ghosts are accepted as real, the possibility of genuine emotional or physical closeness between women is treated as something too strange to process. It's a sharp commentary on how normalized supernatural horror is compared to the still radical idea of women freely connecting with one another on their own terms. For queer viewers, the absurdity becomes poignant. We live in a culture more comfortable with ghosts than with women loving women. When Mary calls the protagonist very pretty and offers what she calls horizontal refreshment, her language may be playful, but it comes wrapped in centuries of coded expression. For much of history, queer women had to cloak their love in humor, subtext, or old-world euphemism, the wink of recognition in literature, film, and conversation. Mary's way of speaking feels almost like a ghostly continuation of that tradition, one that carries both pain and pride. It's easy to laugh at her outdated phrasing, but within it lies a truth about survival. Queer women learn to hide in plain sight, to express care through metaphor, to touch the light without drawing too much attention. Her flirtation, then, isn't about seduction. It's about legacy. It's about an older queer figure reaching out to a younger woman who might still be figuring out what she is allowed to feel. The ghosts chatter around her, teasing, warning, observing. Feels like a chorus of women past and present negotiating how to exist in a space that never made room for them. This entire scene, though comedic in tone, operates as a mirror to queer life. How we haunt narratives that were never written for us. How we linger in cultural spaces that forget us. How we still find ways to leave fingerprints on the world. The humor doesn't undermine the emotion. It protects it. Queer women, especially, understand how humor becomes armor. How laughter allows truth to surface without breaking the spell. When the living woman gasps, "You touched me, I felt it," it becomes a small revelation. To feel another woman's presence, to recognize connection where you didn't expect it, is a moment of awakening. One that queer women will recognize instantly. It's not romantic in the conventional sense, it's existential. It's about realizing that what you've been told is impossible. To see yourself reflected, to be touched by understanding, has just happened. By the end, when she says, "I gotta get out of here before I roll," it's funny, yes, but it's also sad. She's retreating from possibility, from recognition, from the living memory of what women before her dared to feel. The ghosts, watching, remain in their liminal space, unseen, unacknowledged, but present. The scene closes with humor and chaos, yet something lingers, a question about who gets to exist freely, who gets to tell their story, and who remains a ghost in someone else's narrative. For queer and female audiences, this moment lands with bittersweet familiarity. We laugh, we cringe, we recognize ourselves in the ghosts correcting the script, in the older woman who refuses shame, in the living woman who's not yet ready to face herself. The film turns horror's language of haunting into a queer allegory about reclamation. It tells us that ghosts aren't just the dead. They're the parts of ourselves silenced by expectation. But here, those ghosts are speaking, laughing, and taking up space again. For anyone who's ever felt unseen, especially queer women navigating a world that still misunderstands them, this scene isn't about fear. It's about presence, the quiet, defiant kind that refuses to fade even after death. In this scene, starring Anna, Kira, and Victoria, the lines between horror, humor, and heartache blur into something deeply human and deeply queer. What begins as a chaotic meta-horror setup, complete with self-aware banter about final girls and curses, slowly reveals itself as a meditation on how women navigate identity and connection in spaces that are haunted not only by ghosts, but by expectation. On the surface, the scene functions as a clever, tongue-in-cheek take on slasher tropes. The murder house, the unseen killer, the social media influencer cracking jokes for likes. Yet beneath that surface lies a rich subtext about women reclaiming their stories within a genre and within a world that often flattens them into archetypes. Anna's curiosity, Kira's skepticism, and Victoria's mix of defiance and vulnerability come together like facets of a shared female experience. The attempt to make sense of fear, to find humor in chaos, and to stay emotionally connected when everything around them tells them not to. The absurdity of their dialogue, ghosts debating social media strategies, women joking through terror, becomes a kind of resistance, a coded language that queer and lesbian viewers especially might recognize as survival through wit and closeness. Because even as they're trapped in a haunted space, there's a palpable intimacy in how they talk to one another. That blend of teasing, protectiveness, and emotional shorthand that so often defines queer female relationships on screen and in life. When Kira calls Anna weird, it's not an insult but an acknowledgement of otherness that feels affectionate. When they argue over curses or production schedules, what's really being shown is a group of women trying to assert control over a narrative that was never meant to center them. The final girl conversation, in particular, lands like a quiet revelation. The trope, historically, has celebrated resilience while demanding emotional purity. A girl who survives because she conforms to a narrow idea of womanhood. Here, though, that idea is dismantled. Anna's final girl moment isn't about innocence or punishment. It's about solidarity, a woman choosing not to leave another behind. Her refusal to accept that she's the only one who matters becomes a radical act of empathy. It's not every woman for herself. It's we're in this together, even in death. And for queer women watching, that shift resonates powerfully. It echoes the real-world struggle to redefine what strength looks like when the systems around you, whether horror films or social hierarchies, tell you that survival means standing alone. These women don't just survive, they rewrite the script as they go, finding small freedoms in the act of collaboration. Even the humor, jokes about likes and views, the irony of filming a breakdown for social media, mirrors how queer women often mask vulnerability behind performance, how laughter becomes a defense against invisibility. Beneath the absurdity, though, is genuine tenderness. When one character insists, "I'll be your last woman," or whatever, it's awkward and imperfect, but also earnest. The kind of emotional honesty queer audiences rarely see portrayed without cynicism or fetishization. The ghost motif deepens this reading. In horror, ghosts often symbolize unresolved trauma, and here they seem to stand for the lingering weight of unacknowledged women's stories, the versions of themselves they were never allowed to express. When Anna, Kira, and Victoria realize they are the ghosts, it's not tragedy but recognition. They are literally the spirits who stayed behind to keep their own narrative alive. The way they discuss eternity, playing games, and even singing karaoke together becomes less about haunting and more about community, about creating meaning within constraint. For queer viewers, especially queer women, this has particular resonance. It reflects how many of us learn to build chosen families, to find lightness and humor in the very spaces where we were once told we didn't belong. The joke about karaoke, my neck, my back, followed by I don't know that one, lands as both comic relief and metaphor. There's a generational dialogue there, a passing of cultural touchstones, where one woman's expression of confidence or sensuality is met not with shame but curiosity. It's a playful reclamation of space, one that queer women have long carved out through shared art, music, and inside jokes. Even the rocks outside, an almost throwaway line, become symbolic, suggesting something grounding and enduring in contrast to the chaos of the haunted house. Rocks last, they bear witness. So do these women. By the time Victoria insists she takes her chances, the scene has quietly shifted from farce to something almost profound, a statement on how queer women continue to take emotional risks in a world that often renders them invisible or disposable. The scene's refusal to play their connection for shock value or eroticism feels especially significant. Instead, it lingers on the emotional logic that drives them: loyalty, curiosity, courage, and an instinct to protect one another even when logic says to run. This is what makes the moment queer in its essence, not just in its casting or subtext, but in how it reframes intimacy as interdependence rather than possession. It's about seeing, understanding, and holding space for each other, something that resonates deeply with LGBTQ+ audiences who have had to fight for the right to love and be loved without spectacle. And yet, even as the scene celebrates that solidarity, it doesn't ignore how society still struggles with women's emotional power, especially when it exists outside heterosexual frameworks. The jokes about curses and mental breakdowns hint at how women's intuition and emotion are still dismissed as irrational or hysterical. The horror setting becomes an exaggerated mirror of real life, women navigating danger, disbelief, and the pressure to stay composed while being watched. The camera itself, both literal and symbolic, is a reminder of how female behavior is constantly scrutinized, performed, and recorded. By mocking that surveillance through humor, the characters reclaim their agency. They become storytellers instead of subjects. For lesbian and queer audiences, this feels like a wink of recognition, the constant negotiation between authenticity and performance, between what we feel and what we're allowed to show. In that sense, this scene is not just about ghosts and killers, it's about memory, resilience, and reclaiming the right to exist beyond a genre's expectations. When the women laugh, argue, or comfort one another, they embody the kind of emotional truth that horror rarely allows, a truth rooted in connection over spectacle. Their story doesn't need a man, a savior, or even a clear resolution. What it offers instead is a portrait of queer womanhood that feels defiantly alive, even in death. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing women can do, especially in worlds designed to erase them, is simply to keep talking, keep caring, and keep choosing each other, no matter how many times the story tries to end.